right, in this next section here, we want to talk about some of the different styles of expansion tanks that are available to use in hydronic systems. There's two broad categories of tanks. The first would be known as old style, plain steel tanks, often called compression tanks. And then the other general classification of expansion tanks would be what's known as captive air tanks. This would be a tank that has some kind of bladder or some kind of diaphragm in it that would give you a positive separation between the air and the water. That's a good thing. Let's talk a little bit about the plain steel style expansion tanks. These are old school. You will run into these out in older systems and might need to maintain those things. However, the best thing you can do typically with these tanks is, if you're having issues with them or they start leaking or there's problems, is to go ahead and take them out and replace them with a bladder tank. There's a lot of advantages with bladder tanks, and we'll talk about those here in a second. But let's look at these old style expansion tanks. So here's an example up on the screen of a plain steel style expansion tank. And the first thing you want to be able to do is be able to identify what type of a tank you're looking at when you're out in a system or out in, looking at a boiler room. So there's a number of clues that'll tip you off that you're looking at a plain steel tank. The first is the location of that tank. Plain steel tanks are always located up in the system. They're typically above another important component in the hydronic system, and that is the air separator. So that's your first clue. Now, I'm not saying that you couldn't have a bladder or captive air style tank that would be up in the system, but you will never have a plain steel tank that's located or stuffed back in the corner like you can do with a captive air style tank. So there's an important installation detail that you need to pay attention to with these plain steel tanks that also is going to give you a clue that you're looking at that style of tank. So here's what that looks like. If you have a plain steel tank, all right, as represented by this little diagram here, and this is my hydronic system down here. This is my air separator here. All right. The air separator always gets routed up and connected to a plain steel expansion tank. And the reason that we do that is that these plain steel tanks always have a tendency to want to get waterlogged. Essentially, they stop working, right? And as a result of that, whatever air we separate out of the system, we try to divert that up. So the installation detail for them has us connecting them to the air separator. Now, it turns out there's a couple of pieces of trim on these tanks that you'll see as well that can be a clue that you're looking at one of these. The first is the gauge glass. And that gauge glass is mounted on the side of the tank here, like this. And lets us keep an eye on what the level is in that tank. And have an idea whether we're riding at something that looks reasonable or whether that thing might be waterlogged. So you'll see a gauge glass on these plain steel tanks almost all the time, not always. Sometimes you'll see a tank without one, but for the most part, you're going to find a gauge glass on these things. That's another clue that you are looking at one of these things. There's also a couple of trim components on these things. And if you look at the diagram, you will see that there's a couple of important trim components. The first is what's known as a tank drainer. I've got an example of that here. The tank drainer is pretty straightforward. It's just got a valve that opens up and lets you drain water out of the tank. However, if you're going to be able to drain water, you got to undo this plug here, and that lets air into the tank. It's real tough to get water out unless you're letting some air in. So that's what that tank drainer does. Pretty simple device. The other component is kind of interesting. Solves a problem that these tanks have. It gets mounted here at this connection between the where the air comes up from the air separator and connects into the tank. This component is called an air troll fitting, and this air troll fitting is designed to help solve a problem that's, they discovered this probably back in the 50s or 60s. It turns out that the water in the tank ends up being cool, and in the heating system, the water down here is going to be hot. Well, that ends up setting up a circulation where the hot water wants to sort of go climbing up that line, cool water wants to spill down. Well, The problem that causes is we've got air up in this tank, so this water is full of air that goes out in the system, and some of that air gets lost in air vents and whatnot. The hot water comes up, it's had the air separated out of it, it starts grabbing a hold of some of that air. So essentially you're grabbing hold of that air and releasing it out in the system. And slowly but surely your feed valve will feed and your level will rise in your tank, and you essentially waterlog your tank. So that the air control fitting is designed to break up that essentially gravity circulation. So here's a cutaway of that air control fitting. And you can see, interestingly, that there's essentially a baffle in there. And as the water comes up, it's got to make a U-turn around that baffle before it enters into the tank. But at the same time, air bubbles that come up are allowed to rise up and enter the tank through the tube. So we want to make sure we cut that tube in that air control fitting so it rides pretty close to the top of the tank, because it needs to be above the level of the water in the tank. So that's an air control fitting, and that's the problem it solves. And that's the schematic essentially for piping up one of these plain steel compression tanks. Next, we'll talk about captive air style tanks.